guys, this is Svetlana from Comic Cosplay, and today I want to show you a cool little project you can craft yourself at home, the Amban sniper rifle from the Mandalorian show. I think this weapon is one of the coolest props in the Star Wars universe, and since my husband Benny already made the blueprint in one of his previous videos, I thought it's about time to finally make this thing myself. I used to actually super accessible and affordable tools and materials. Like this thing here is actually mostly made out of foam scraps, and I used like a simple box cutter and like hot glue and contact cement, and like so everything is basically super cheap and simple, so you can craft one yourself. And well, just follow my instructions in this video because this is the way. And you can find the download for the blueprint in the video description down below. And for more tips, tutorials and crafting ideas, just check out my cosplay crafting books on comiccosplay.com. I have one for foam fantasy weapons, one that shows you how to work with an airbrush, one for guns and rifles, for example, and so many more. You can get them physical like these ones, or also as direct downloads. And now let's start with the video. Before we start, if you want to follow along with this build, make sure to watch the entire video all the way to the end. I will show all the mistakes and errors I made along the way, so make sure you don't repeat them. Anyway, let's start with the blueprint. If you watched Benny's blueprint tutorial, you saw that he made the first drawing of this rifle based on a 3D file he found on the internet. I already assumed that it would be not very screen accurate, but anyway, I wanted to start crafting and just see how far I get before I noticed the first mistake. So he printed it out for me in original size, I taped all pages together and cut the whole thing out. The side view would be my main reference. At least I thought so at this point. By the way, it's 150 cm long, so here is a size reference. For the core, I decided to use a PVC pipe with a 23 mm outer diameter. I placed some marks for the stock and heated up the plastic carefully with a heat gun. As you can see, I only heated up one small point, so I could bend it into shape here. This way I made sure the pipe would actually fit into the rifle butt, I mean stock. For this project I mainly used my leftover foam scraps. I don't like to throw stuff away, and so I could turn this pile of trash into a cool prop. Now for the buttstock. I cut out the shape of my blueprint, grabbed some 10 mm high density foam from Cosplay Shop BE, all products are linked in the video description by the way, and traced it onto the material. I cut it out super roughly with my box cutter and also glued some more old scraps together to get a second layer. Oh, and then I also used some 5 mm foam as well. At the end, I had to find a way to cover the whole PVC pipe. So I marked the outline of my heat-shaped pipe onto my blueprint and traced this then onto my foam. To connect all layers, I used contact cement, which I put into a little squeeze bottle first. This way the glue isn't super smelly and barely releases any fumes. Next, I added a good amount of hot glue and connected pipe and foam to each other. I also added more 2 mm foam here as well, as you can see. Then I covered everything with 5 mm foam on top. For the following step, I carefully tried to carve the stock into shape, but as you can see, I got some pretty nasty holes here. Not a problem though, I would cover them up later. So next I sanded the whole thing nice and smooth with my Dremel and then heat sealed the surface to get rid of the leftover foam lines. I actually used a second printout of my blueprint to constantly check the proportions of my rifle. Now to the middle and most complicated part. I kept on cutting the blueprint into smaller sections and basically just tried to guess the basic shape. I didn't really have a proper plan here and just hoped everything would work out. I made this part pretty much the same way as the stock, since I still had to build in the pipe somehow. So basically I just cut and glued a few pieces together and kept some space for the PVC rod. Once I connected everything, I smoothed out the seams. Then I started searching for some proper reference photos to get all the details right. Someone actually uploaded all these amazing reference photos of a replica from a Comic-Con, I guess? And they were just incredibly helpful. So if you hear this, Scott Kaufman, thank you. You are awesome. Based on these photos though, I noticed that the whole blueprint of Benni was wrong. Like so wrong. So wrong, in fact, that I forced him to completely redo the whole thing. I even kept on finding more mistakes while I was working on the project. It was really fun. So if you want to craft along and already downloaded the old blueprint from his previous video, there is a completely new and updated version in our shop now. Well, but the old blueprint was so wrong that even the base wouldn't work anymore. So I had to rip off the whole thing, clean up the pipe again and add a new base. So wrong. Next, however, I could finally prepare some additional layers and start with the details. As you can see, working with a proper blueprint is actually super important. I tried to stay as close as possible to the new reference photos, but the dimensions of my foam layers and the PVC pipe inside limited me a bit. In addition, I kept on using only very simple tools and materials, so you can follow along from home and craft your own Mandalorian rifle. So doing everything with a simple Dremel was a tiny bit tricky and didn't turn out as clean as I wished. For the layers on top, I used my blueprint and basically made some wraps for the main body. I marked the areas where I needed to add some glue and then carefully placed this part onto the rifle. Some other parts had to be Dremeled before and were then attached as well. The whole rifle was basically just a giant puzzle which I slowly had to piece together. I constantly kept on checking my photo references to get an idea of the thickness of each element. This front piece, for example, looked like it was much wider than the main body, so I used a 10 and 5mm layer and got pretty close to the original shape, I guess. Afterwards, I could add more elements and finally began with the smaller details. Sanding these tiny things was kinda hard though. Well, and while I tried to do everything super clean and nice, this front thing here looked more and more like crap. So I cut it off from the main body, ripped it off the PVC pipe and made two new walls with separated elements on top. Now this looked much better. Afterwards, I smoothed out more seams, covered them with more wraps and did more raids in Pokemon Go. Now I sanded a few angles down and all those details got smaller and smaller. Next, I added this whatever it's called thing on top, placed a tiny little hexagon ring to the side and added even more tiny little square thingies. I believe this part here is supposed to be a safety button, so it would only come to one side, right? Anyway, I cut it out of foam and glued it onto the body. Then I went onto the rails next. I cut out some 5mm strips and placed them piece by piece onto the top of the pipe. A little bit of super glue here and there, a layer of 2mm on top and some more rail stripes onto the bottom. I actually had no idea how the bottom looked like, but I found this image of a Mando toy, so I thought this would be right. Next, I placed some rivets with super glue and got my reference for the thick golden wires. I cut them out of 2mm foam, carefully rounded the edges with my Dremel and fixed them with super glue as well. I preferred this adhesive mostly for small details. Foam dowels are actually great for a few elements as well. Oh, and then I noticed in the corner of one of my reference photos that my barrel jacket was still wrong. Apparently the lower section was actually thinner than the top, so I ripped it off again and placed a different 5mm layer instead. Now for the trigger. Instead of one 10mm piece, I cut out two layers of 5mm foam. This way I was just able to get the shape more precise and only had to clean out the seams. I then glued it piece by piece onto the stock and kept on setting my puzzle together. Please ignore these ugly holes in the stock. They will be hidden later, promise. The trigger guard was simply wrapped around the grip and got some support with contact cement. Done with this part as well. Now let me finally fix this ugliness. To even out the really huge gaps, I used foam clay from Lumen's workshop. I applied some water so the material would stick and spread the clay onto my grey foam. A little bit of water helps to dissolve the clay and even it out even more. In addition, I worked with flexi filler, which is a little bit like dissolved foam clay. Gosh, this was a crazy mess. However, I was able to even out the bumps and close the holes quite easily. Once dried, the surface was still pretty uneven and had drops and everything. Luckily, foam clay and flexi filler can easily be sanded. And before you ask, I used a sanding sponge here. Much better. Now, despite of all the Dremel work, the seams of the individual layers were still quite visible. So I cut out a few pieces of 1mm foam, added glue and covered up these areas. Next, I just had to smooth out the edges a bit. Looks much better. Finally, I only had to add a few very last details. Seriously, this is actually my favorite part. Seeing how everything comes together slowly is really exciting. Now to all the itsy bitsy stuff around the barrel. First, I placed some marks based on my blueprints and shortened my pipe with a handsaw. I made a ring here, slid it over, then made a ring there and secured everything with contact cement. Now the next part had 3 rounded edges. See, like in this reference photo from the set. So I slid over some 5mm foam and added these 2 pieces onto the PVC rod. Next, I carefully wrapped a 5mm sheet around and squeezed the seam together at the bottom. I applied some force with a roll of duct tape and I guess I got quite close to the original shape. Then I covered up the open areas, cut the excess material away, dremeled the rest of it into shape and added some 2mm edges. Now the next part was a little bit tricky. This part of the pipe isn't just round, but actually has 8 even sides. I looked it up, it's called an octagonal prism. So first I tried it with a 5mm square with cutout gaps. Wrapped around the pipe, it created 8 edges this way. I smoothed out the gluing seam, but the result was too thick since the round part and the octagonal rod were actually supposed to be evenly thick. Next, I grabbed the cut-out triangle foam gaps from before and glued them onto a thinner 19mm pipe. I covered everything in glue and carefully wrapped it with 1mm foam. Looked much better. Last but not least, I superglued it onto the rest of the rifle. Next came the weirdly shaped muzzle. I cut it out of my blueprint and noticed again that it was all wrong. So Benni used some more photos to correct the shape and I got a new template. For the base shape, I used a 3mm thick PVC board, which is more sturdy than foam. A box cutter worked well enough to cut it out, but clearly needed a little bit more force than usual. Once done, this was a great base for the next steps. After separating my patterns and tracing them onto foam, I carefully glued the blades on. All parts were then shaped with a Dremel and turned into a pretty cool muzzle. I cut off more PVC pipe and slid the muzzle into it. To connect both of these parts, I used a bunch of hot glue and just added more foam rings on top. Okay, now let's connect everything and add some more details here and there. The muzzle also required these lines, which I just cut in and widened with my heat gun. Now to the next part, the lower pipe. I used this thinner 7mm PVC rod as a base and placed 2 pieces of foam onto both ends. I filled one with hot glue and drilled a hole into the barrel jacket. As you can see, I just placed the whole thing with some glue. Now these attachments here were basically also just a long 2mm strip of foam, which I wrapped around the whole rifle. Next, pretty much only the sniper scope was missing. I used a PVC pipe with 19mm of outer diameter, marked the areas for my foam and wrapped it around the pipe. I also got some filling for the inside and just a few more stripes of 2mm foam. For the lines, I carefully cut into the material and heated them up to make them more visible. As you can see, I constantly worked with the blueprint for reference. Benni got feedback from me all the time and adjusted his drawings while I kept on building the rifle. For the attachment I used 5mm foam, which I heated up and molded directly onto the pipe. Now I had to Dremel a curved angle into a 10mm foam piece and carefully connected it to the scope. Okay, attaching this part was a bit tricky and basically just trial and error. I just kept on cutting the attachment shorter and shorter until I figured out the final form. Well, and contact cement was totally fine to even hold this part into place. Yes, quite happy how it turned out so far. Well, and this was the final foam build of my Mandalorian rifle. It's surely not perfect, but I think I did a good job provided it's all EVA foam. In total, this took me 3 days to make, but I think if I haven't played so much World of Warcraft at the same time, I could have it done in 2. But hey, look what I got! So now it's finally time for painting. First, however, I had to heat seal the foam to smooth out the material and close the pores. Then Benni used a water-based filler called Quick Seal to fix all those gaps that were still visible. Next, he applied 3 layers of Flex Bond onto the stock and the muzzle. These areas were still super rough from all the sanding work, and Flex Bond is able to smooth that out nicely. Also, this middle part seemed like it has a rough texture in the photo reference, so instead Benni dabbed on Flex Bond here to get this effect. Once dried, the result looked like this. I wanted to prime the rest of the rifle with Plastidip, so I cut open a trash bag and placed it on my balcony. Then I heated up a can of gummy dip, which is like the German version of Plastidip, in hot water, and applied 4 thick layers of it onto my rifle. Once done and dry, my Mandalorian rifle was finally ready to be painted by my husband Benni. To start, he grabbed some masking tape and a bunch of airbrush paints from Vallejo. While painting, he constantly checked the reference photos on his phone to choose the right colors. First though, he applied a layer of airbrush primer. This is just the basic coat for the upcoming colors. Next, he wanted to paint the parts that needed to remain black. Leaving them plain black, however, would look very boring, so instead he took a dark silver, mixed it with a bit of airbrush thinner and lightly dusted over all the dark areas. Then he put a bit of color on his fingers and rubbed them over the surface. This gives him just more control than a brush or a piece of cloth. The result looked like this. Afterwards, he took some masking tape and secured the areas he just finished. Next, it was time for the main body. For this, he applied a thicker layer of gunmetal silver, but left some shadows in the corners and even increased them with a dark grey. And then he used his fingers again to add highlights around the edges and generally make them look dirtier. This made it almost look like real metal. He applied the same techniques to paint the main body as well. Adding imperfections and smudge like this definitely helps your piece to look more real. Afterwards, he used a fine brush and some gold to paint the details on the side. For the tip, he first wanted to make it brown like in the reference photos. Since I looked at many different references, however, I knew that the muzzle was actually silver though. No idea why the replica at the Comic-Con has this brown muzzle actually. So he applied a base color of silver first and then took a gold, a red and a blue paint. If you apply them one after the other, you can create a really cool looking scorch effect. Finally, he masked off some more areas and then applied gold for the scope holders, brown to the middle piece and more brown to cover the entire buttstock. After removing all the masking tape, the base paint was done. Next, I added a layer of satin spray varnish all over the prop. We actually did all of this outside since the rifle was too long to fit in our spray booth. After it was dry, Benni grabbed some black and brown oil paint and began adding some weathering. This paint just takes far longer to dry and gives you enough time to add shadows and dirt around your edges. Benni also used an old sock to dab on a bit of brown to the middle part. Adding a bit of oil color here and there definitely helps to make your prop look more real. Next up was the stock. This one was supposed to be out of wood, so Benni had to paint on a grain here. First he took a white brush, some oil paint and tried to apply a wooden grain. It turned out like crap though, so he wiped all of it off again to try something else. For the second attempt he used his airbrush again and went over the stock with horizontal moves. He only applied a bit of darker brown, but after a while this actually began to look like wood. Next he took a fine brush and applied a couple of more brown shades by hand. The result looked far better, not perfect, but good enough I think. And with this the paint job was finally done as well. Altogether, Benni worked around 2 more days on the paint job, but I think it was worth it. Now we just had to fix the oil paint with another coat of spray varnish and the Mandalorian rifle was done. This was a really fun little project. The result surely didn't turn out perfect, but I think we got quite close to a clean 3D print. Plus we used mostly only cheap materials and tools, so you can craft your own rifle as well now.
I really hope you liked this video, and at this point thanks so much especially to Rob Pauser who made the initial 3D file, who inspired Benni to make the blueprint and which inspired me to make then the final prop. And also thanks a lot to Scott Kaufman for his amazing reference photos from the Comic-Con, and also a huge thank you goes to my dogs Zelda and Midna, who were incredibly cute during the whole project and are still pretty cute. And if you want to make the whole costume, you can actually watch Jessica Negri's newest video. She made a Mandalorian herself, like completely the whole thing, and she showed in her video how she made everything, and yeah, the final result is pretty awesome. As always, you can find product links for all tools and materials we used in the video description down below. These are actually Amazon affiliate links, and if you click on them, you are directly supporting our work. So thank you very much for this. And if you still have any questions regarding to my okay-ish Amban sniper rifle from the Mandalorian, or have any other crafting questions, or have any feedback, what we can bake, any wishes, anything you want to see, or like if you just want to write down corgi in the comments because you have no idea what to write, do your thing. And yeah, you're very welcome to do this because this really supports our channel, and you can also support us by going to Patreon, or yeah, also liking and subscribing. Also hit the notification bell so you don't miss our very next video. And yeah, also don't forget to buy my books, and see you in the very next video. So bye bye, see you very soon.